We picture Rome falling to barbarians, warriors crashing through marble gates, fire in the streets, civilization ending in a single dramatic moment. That's the myth. The reality is quieter than that, and honestly, worse. In 378, an emperor rode into Adrianople and never came back. His army was annihilated, not weakened, destroyed. And the man who inherited what was left, Theodosius, made a decision no Roman emperor had ever made before. He didn't rebuild the border, he dissolved it. The Goths were settled inside Roman territory, semi-autonomous, armed, self-governing. Not outside the empire anymore, but inside it. The border didn't fail in the conventional sense. More accurately, Rome stopped treating it like something that needed to exist. And there were already signs the system was dying long before that treaty was ever signed. Coins so debased they couldn't reliably buy bread anymore, while the Goths were being paid in gold just to remain calm. Danube forts increasingly manned by the same tribal groups those walls had originally been built to keep out, and the old Roman religions being criminalized because failing states eventually demand one form of obedience, not many. Then Theodosius dies in 395, and the empire splits in two. Not because barbarians invaded, because the system was exhausted. That's the part people miss about collapse. Empires don't usually fall because outsiders break in. They fall because the people running them decide the old mechanisms are no longer sustainable, and start replacing them with temporary solutions that become permanent. And if you understand how Rome's last united emperor turned defeat into managed surrender, you start noticing some very familiar patterns right now. Welcome back to The Roman Pattern. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, CEO of Command Your Brand. Check us out at commandyourbrand.com. And now, our story. Adrianople wasn't really a battle. It was an autopsy performed on a living patient. Valens marched out with roughly 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army. And by the end of the day, both he and most of those men were gone. Somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon. That's beyond a defeat. That's decapitation. And the force that destroyed them wasn't originally an invading nation in the way many people imagine it. They were refugee populations, families, wagons, entire communities that had spent months on the far side of the Danube trying to get into Roman territory. Rome let them in. Then Rome starved them. Then Rome tried to enslave them. Then the Goths fought back, and they won. Usually the story ends there. Barbarians defeat Rome, civilization starts collapsing, end of discussion. But that's actually not the important part. Not yet. What matters is what came after. Because the man who inherited this catastrophe, a Spanish general named Theodosius, didn't try to reverse the damage. He institutionalized it. To understand why Theodosius made the decisions he made, you have to understand the pressure closing in around the empire at that point. The Goths didn't arrive at the Danube because they were launching some grand imperial conquest. They were running. From the east, the Huns had erupted out of the Eurasian steppe. Nobody really knew where they came from, though honestly the Goths probably didn't care much about the origins at that point. What mattered was survival. The Huns fought in ways Rome struggled to counter. Mounted warfare, hit-and-run attacks. Mobility the Roman military system wasn't designed for. They appeared, disappeared, and came back again. Armies built around formation combat had trouble adapting to that kind of warfare, and the Gothic peoples living along the steppe had even less ability to resist it. So they moved west, toward the Danube, toward the Roman Empire. And in 376, the numbers arriving at the river were unlike anything Rome had dealt with before. Not just warriors, entire migrating populations. The Tervingi, the Gathungi, old men, women, children, and carts loaded with whatever remained of their lives. They weren't coming to conquer Rome. They were coming to Rome for entry. And this is where the border mechanism actually failed. Not in battle, but administratively. The Roman commanders on the frontier made what, on paper, looked like a rational decision. Let them in, process them, settle them, convert refugees into taxpayers and soldiers. Rome had absorbed outside peoples for centuries. That wasn't unusual. That was part of how the empire functioned. But the system executing that policy was already hollow. The logistics collapsed almost immediately. There wasn't enough food, enough land, enough infrastructure to absorb populations that size. And the official responsible for managing supplies were corrupt and stripped the system for profit. Provisions were sold off. Money disappeared. The Goths were pushed into camps and left there starving. Then things got uglier. Roman officials reportedly offered them dog meat in exchange for their children being sold into slavery. Not because this was coherent imperial policy, because the bureaucracy itself had decayed into the point where it couldn't perform one task that might have stabilized the situation: integrating outsiders into the Roman system. That's important. The Goths didn't rebel because they were irrational savages. They rebelled because Rome broke its own mechanisms. And when the rebellion started, the empire discovered something even worse. The Roman military system had already deteriorated so badly that it couldn't contain the crisis. The army was underfunded, overextended, stretched across enormous frontiers with fewer reliable troops than the empire pretended it had. So the border didn't really break from the outside. It was already broken internally. The refugee crisis just exposed it. Then you get to Adrianople itself. In August of 378, Valens decided he's not waiting for reinforcements. The Goths are near Adrianople in Thrace. Western troops under Gratian are approaching, but Valens wants the victory for himself. And this is where people tend to misunderstand what's happening. This isn't fundamentally a military story. It's a financial story wearing military clothing. Valens needed victory because he needed legitimacy. He needed legitimacy because the treasury was failing. And the treasury was failing because debased currency no longer bought loyalty the way it once had. The decision to fight that battle was made long before anyone stepped onto the field. Every debasement of the currency, every frontier fort left unrepaired, every politically loyal but incompetent appointment, every short-term financial decision, all of that converges at Adrianople. The battle itself collapses almost immediately. Valens attacks before the deployment is complete. The Gothic cavalry, believed to be absent, returns at speed and slams into the Roman flank. The formation breaks. Retreat becomes rout. Rout becomes slaughter. And 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army disappears in an afternoon. After Adrianople, Rome can no longer defend the Balkans in any meaningful way. Not temporarily, structurally. That distinction matters. There's no reserve army waiting, no second wave, no strategic depth behind the disaster. The field army destroyed there was essentially the last one the East could assemble at scale. So when people say the border was breached, that's not really accurate. The border ceased to exist, and Theodosius inherited not frontier to restore, but a vacuum to manage. Theodosius takes power in 379. Experienced general, son of a respected general. He understands warfare, command structures, and military logistics. But he also understands what he doesn't have. No functioning army, no real money, no defensible border. What he inherits is a refugee crisis that became a military crisis, that became a legitimacy crisis, all collapsing into each other at the same time. Money, borders, power. We say that often. All failing simultaneously. And his response isn't restoration, it's restructuring. That's what declining systems do, actually. They stop trying to restore what existed before and start redefining dysfunction as the new normal. Theodosius doesn't rebuild the legions because, realistically, he can't. The recruiting base is gone. Italy isn't producing large military populations anymore. The provinces are strained themselves. Africa functions more as a tax engine than a manpower reservoir. So eventually he does what resource-constrained systems almost always do. He outsources. In 382, after years of fighting that increasingly looked like negotiations, with occasional violence attached to them, Theodosius signs a treaty with the Goths, and the terms are extraordinary. The Goths are allowed to settle inside Roman territory. They receive agricultural land in the Balkans. They remain under their own leadership, with their own customs, their own legal structures. They do not fully assimilate into Roman civil life. In exchange, they provide military service when called upon. Now Rome had made agreements with outside peoples before that, but earlier treaties usually worked towards absorption. Outsiders eventually became Roman. This treaty preserves Gothic identity inside the empire itself. That's the real shift. It creates a parallel nation within Roman borders. The border fault line doesn't crack here. It's legally dissolved. The Danube is no longer functioning as the hard edge of Roman civilization. It becomes more of an administrative line that people cross under negotiated terms. And once that happens, the territory itself changes. Now you have two populations occupying the same imperial space, without sharing the same loyalties, language, legal system, or increasingly, even a worldview. At the same time, the financial problems deepen, because Rome isn't just giving land, it's paying subsidies in gold. An armed, autonomous population inside imperial territory is effectively being compensated not to revolt. And there's a pattern empires eventually discover when they start paying tribute. The price never stabilizes. It rises. Because the tribute-paying state demonstrates weakness every time it pays, and the recipient learns that pressure is profitable. The Goths weren't grateful. They were strategic. They understood Rome needed them more than they needed Rome, and each year that imbalance became more obvious as Roman military strength declined further. So the settlement wasn't really a solution. It was an admission. And admissions have a way of becoming permanent realities. That's how borders usually fail historically. Not in cinematic invasions. They thin out first. Enforcement becomes inconsistent. Administrative fiction replaces actual control. Then eventually someone formalizes what everybody already knows. Theodosius didn't lose the border in the conventional sense. He declared it unnecessary. That's a different kind of collapse, and probably a more permanent one. Well, this is happening externally. Something else is happening inside the empire. Theodosius is building a theological state. In 380, the Edict of Thessalonica declares Nicene Christianity the sole religion of the empire. Not preferred, exclusive. Every other form of worship becomes illegal, and this is a radical shift for Rome. For centuries, the empire had tolerated enormous religious diversity, not necessarily because Romans were philosophically tolerant in the modern sense, but because tolerance was efficient. People focused on rebellion, on taxes, land disputes, political power, not theology. Theodosius changes that equation. Religious conformity becomes tied directly to loyalty to the state. And over the following years, the laws intensify. Pagan temples are closed, assets confiscated, sacrifices criminalized. Even private worship is eventually prohibited. That isn't just spiritual reform, that's an economic transformation. The pagan temples of the empire held enormous wealth, accumulated over centuries: land, gold, institutions, endowments. When those assets are seized, that wealth doesn't disappear, it moves. And most of it moves in the hands of the Christian church, which suddenly becomes one of the largest institutional landowners in the empire. And Theodosius needs that church, because increasingly the army isn't fully his anymore. The military structure is becoming dependent on barbarian troops and barbarian generals, while the traditional Roman political order is hollowing out. The church offers something else: hierarchy, communication networks, administrative infrastructure, and moral legitimacy. And now, wealth. In exchange, the emperor receives something the treasury can't reliably purchase anymore: authority. Not political authority alone, sacred authority. The emperor becomes God's representative, rather than merely Rome's ruler, which sounds stable until you think through the implications. Because if legitimacy comes from the church, then the church can challenge legitimacy. The emperor doesn't dominate the institution. He becomes dependent on it. And there's another cost here that people often miss. Institutional flexibility disappears. Rome had survived for centuries, partly because it could absorb outside systems: Greek philosophy, Egyptian cults, Persian religious ideas. Rome historically integrated rather than eradicated. The flexibility was structural strength. Theodosius replaces it with a single authorized ideological pillar, and single pillars become dangerous because they only need to fracture once. Millions of people still believed in the old systems. They didn't suddenly vanish. They went quiet. But quiet and loyal aren't the same thing. States enforcing ideological conformity don't create true consensus. They create hidden opposition, and hidden opposition waits. It waits for weakness. Then one day, the system realizes it can no longer distinguish genuine belief from performative compliance. That's one of the costs of enforced orthodoxy. The state loses the ability to accurately read itself. And systems that cannot accurately read themselves cannot repair themselves. Meanwhile, the monetary system keeps deteriorating. Not suddenly. Money rarely dies dramatically. Usually it erodes slowly enough that people normalize each stage of the decline as it happens. Theodosius inherits a currency already weakened by more than a century of debasement. But wars, subsidies, civil conflicts, church construction, military expenditures, all of it demands spending beyond what the system can sustain. So the coins lose more metal. The silver content declines further. Prices rise. And by the late Roman standards, inflation isn't measured abstractly anymore. It's measured in survival. The relationship between the currency and the actual goods becomes increasingly theoretical. The state responds the way states almost always respond to inflationary crisis. First, by trying to control prices. When that fails, by trying to control people. The land tax becomes increasingly aggressive because the tax base itself is shrinking. Population declines from plague, warfare, and migration. Agricultural production fails. So instead of reducing expenditures, the state raises burdens on whomever remains productive. And this is where the rural economics begin collapsing. Farmers abandon land because remaining on it means being trapped inside impossible tax obligations. Then the curiles, the local elites responsible for tax collection, become personally liable for shortfalls. If taxes aren't collected, they pay the difference themselves. So they flee too. Some attach themselves to powerful aristocrats for protection. Others enter the church where tax is exempt. And suddenly the fiscal crisis feeds directly into the power crisis. The church becomes wealthier and more administratively capable, while the state becomes weaker and more dependent on the church's infrastructure. This is how fiscal instability transforms into government instability. The state raises taxes to compensate for declining revenue. Those taxes drive productive people toward exempt institutions. The tax base shrinks further. Then taxes rise again. The loop tightens. And almost nobody inside the system asks for the most dangerous question of all. Maybe the empire doesn't need more revenue. Maybe it needs less expenditure. But reducing expenditure means reducing military capacity. And reducing military capacity means losing control faster. So the spending trajectory continues even though it can't be sustained. This isn't really mismanagement anymore. It's geometry. Imperial systems almost always reach the point where the cost of maintaining scale grows faster than productive economy supporting that scale. More borders, more administration, more enemies generated by expansion itself. Theodosius didn't create that geometry, but he was trapped inside it. And every solution available to him accelerated the trajectory a little further. Over 16 years, Theodosius fights 2 civil wars. Not against outside invaders, against Romans. First against Magnus Maximus, then against Eugenius. And both victories rely heavily on Gothic troops. That pattern matters. Every time the empire fractures internally, it is reassembled not by traditional Roman military structures, but by barbarian mercenary forces fighting for payment. Theodosius doesn't reunify Rome through restored Roman strength. He purchases temporary coherence, and every purchase becomes more expensive. After the Battle of Frigidus in 394, Gothic casualties are enormous. Thousands die securing Theodosius' victory. The Goths notice this. They notice that they are increasingly doing the dying, while Rome is increasingly doing the directing. And the resentment accumulates quickly. Like every other pressure inside this system, at the same time, imperial authority itself becomes increasingly centralized. The emperor is no longer pretending to be the first citizen under the old republican framework. Now he is a divine instrument. That's the Theodosian shift. Not merely a Christian emperor, an emperor whose authority is cosmic. And while Theodosius is alive, it works because he personally understands how to operate every major mechanism: military, financial, religious, and political. But systems dependent on exceptional individuals are fragile by definition. They aren't stable systems anymore. They're temporary balances. And temporary balances eventually fail. Theodosius leaves behind two sons, Arcadius and Honorius. Young, inexperienced, unprepared. Neither has meaningful governance. Neither has commanded armies or negotiated frontier crises or managed imperial finance. They aren't just personal weaknesses. They're structural vulnerabilities. Theodosius understands this, so he appoints guardians. Stilicho in the west, Rufinus in the east. Then he divides the empire itself. Arcadius rules from Constantinople. Honorius rules the west. And this division isn't really an innovation, it's confession. The empire has become too large, too expensive, too administratively complex for one ruler to maintain. The split in 395 simply formalizes what was already true. The East retains wealth, trade routes, population density, and functioning administration. The West inherits debt, military weakness, collapsing borders, shrinking revenues, and a massive Gothic presence inside imperial territory. And the protector of the Western Empire is a half-Vandal general. That isn't irony, it's diagnosis. When the guardians of your civilization are people who would have been considered external armies a generation earlier, the line has already been crossed. Theodosius didn't destroy Rome. Actually, more accurately, he was probably the last person capable of slowing its collapse at all. But the system he eventually inherited didn't really contain a recovery mechanism anymore. Only slower collapse or faster collapse. Look at the sequence. The border breaks because the military system has already been hollowed out financially. The solution becomes managed integration instead of restoration. The Goths are settled internally, not absorbed completely, creating a permanent parallel structure inside the empire. The money fails because expenditures outpace productive capacity. The state debases currency to maintain its obligations. Debasement weakens loyalty. Weak loyalty forces reliance on outside military power. Outside military power demands payment. Payment accelerates the treasury collapse. The loop closes. Then faith becomes enforcement because political legitimacy alone no longer stabilizes the system. But enforced ideological conformity destroys flexibility. And flexibility had been one of Rome's core survival mechanisms for centuries. Then power centralizes because fragmentation threatens immediate collapse. But centralized systems dependent on individual competence become catastrophically vulnerable when competence disappears. And eventually, one death, Theodosius himself, reveals the structure underneath was already failing. That's the pattern. Empires rarely collapse because enemies become impossibly strong. They collapse because the mechanisms holding them together, money, borders, legitimacy, become hollow internally while still appearing functional externally. Then one event exposes the reality. Theodosius was the last emperor of a united Rome because he was the last emperor capable of maintaining the illusion of unity. After him, even the illusion stops mattering. The East survives. The West inherits the liabilities, debts, weak rulers, fragmented authority, shrinking military capacity. And only a few decades later, Alaric walks into Rome itself because the treasury can no longer defend what the empire still claims to rule. That's another autopsy for another day. Look at the mechanisms, not the costumes, the mechanisms. A border that still physically exists, but no longer functions because the political will to enforce it has deteriorated. A currency losing purchasing power gradually, through 1,000 temporary decisions that all seem necessary in isolation. A state enforcing ideological conformity because dissent feels existential rather than manageable. a military structure increasingly dependent on contractors, proxies, and external forces because maintaining internal capacity has become too expensive. A leadership class centralizing authority while competence declines because systems under pressure increasingly reward loyalty over ability. This isn't metaphor, it's mechanism. And mechanisms repeat across centuries because the pressures creating them are structural. Money that fails, borders that dissolve, power concentrating beyond the point of competence. Those pressures don't belong exclusively to antiquity. They belong to scale, to empire, to systems growing larger than their ability to maintain themselves. Theodosius looked at a civilization already hollowed out internally and chose management over restoration. He called it settlement. He called it reform. He called it unity. But when he died, the cracks he managed became the fault lines, along which the empire permanently split apart. And that's the real warning here. Collapse doesn't begin when systems stop functioning. Collapse begins when systems stop solving problems and start managing them instead. When borders become suggestions, when money becomes confidence without substance, when power depends on institutions it no longer controls. This is the pattern, and it isn't finished. This has been the Roman Pattern. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Please like this video, leave us a comment, and smash the subscribe button if you want more of the Roman Pattern.